Hey everybody, this is chapter 11 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein. It's translated by Adam Baltner. Chapter 11 is titled Eating and Being Eaten. It starts off with a segment from Samuel Beckett's Endgame. Ham. Nature has forgotten us. Clove. There's no more nature. Ham. No more nature, you exaggerate. Clove. In the vicinity. Section 1. The moment. If Adorno's second post-1945 intensive engagement with Marx was externally motivated, insofar as it was prompted by his students, it also followed the development of his own theory, and particularly his work on negative dialectics. According to Rolf Tiedemann, this text, quote, crystallized from a lecture course Adorno held in the winter semester of 1960-61 under the title Ontology and Dialectics. A series of lectures of the same title delivered by Adorno at the Collège de France in March 1961 formed the first version of the second section of Negative Dialectics. Subsequently, from 1964 to 66, Adorno successively taught no fewer than 3 courses on subjects or topics which are also at the center of negative dialectics, which he was working on intensively at the time. End quote. Tiedemann. These were the lecture courses History and Freedom in the winter semester of 1964 to 65, Metaphysics, Concept and Problems in the summer semester of 1965, and a course from the winter semester of 1965 to 66, bearing the title of The End Result of Adorno's Efforts. Negative Dialectics. Footnote. These lectures have been published as Ontology and Dialectics, 1960/61. History and Freedom Lectures, 1964 to 65. Metaphysics, Concept and Problems, and Lectures on Negative Dialectics, fragments of a lecture course, 1965-1966. And footnote. Quote, philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize philosophy was missed. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, their resignation in the face of reality had crippled philosophy in itself, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried, end quote. Adorno. These introductory sentences from Negative Dialectics invoke the critique of philosophy articulated by Marx in his introduction to A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right and Theses on Feuerbach. At the same time, this prelude is also a rejection of Lukács's attempt to heal with an act of theoretical violence the schism between theory and practice, which appears to Adorno as irreparable for the time being. Quote, the transition that Marx believed was just around the corner in 1848 or thereabouts did not take place. The qualitative leap that would change the world did not occur, and the proletariat failed to constitute itself as the subject-object of history, as it was supposed to according to Marx's own theory. End quote. Adorno. Therefore, quote, today we simply cannot think any more as Marx thought, namely that the revolution was imminent, simply because, on the one hand, the proletariat in Marx's day was not integrated in bourgeois society, and on the other hand, bourgeois society did not yet possess the vast instruments of power, both actual physical instruments of power and also psychological instruments in the broadest sense, that it now has. Both factors, together with the increasing process of integration, have come together to make the concept of a revolution highly problematic nowadays. End quote. Adorno. According to Adorno, Theses on Feuerbach, the 11th of which Adorno alludes to in the prelude of Negative Dialectics, quote, cannot be correctly understood in abstracto, or severed from the historical dimension. They take on their meaning only in the context of the expectation of imminent revolution which existed at that time. Without such an expectation, they degenerate into mumbo-jumbo. Once this given possibility failed to be realized, Marx spent decades in the British Museum writing a theoretical work on national economy. That Marx did so without having engaged in much praxis, in reality is not a matter of mere biographical accident. A historical (element) is imprinted even in this, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, Marx demanded as little as any other philosopher that the shape of thought should be measured according to practice, that it be tailored to practical needs at the expense of truth. Marx spoke contemptuously of scholars who sacrificed something of their knowledge for the sake of a practical thesis to be demonstrated of achieving some effect. He called them, quote, wretches, end quote, lumpen, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. End footnote. Where the, quote, moment to realize, in quote, philosophy, a moment, quote, at which, as Adorno suspected, liberation was once possible, end quote, is missed. Yet no new possibility to realize philosophy is visible, even from afar. There exists either a practice which acts as though the revolution were immediately pending, as though revolution were now only that, quote, litany of the unmediated unity of theory and practice, end quote, which Adorno sees at work in Soviet Marxism, or as though it were, quote, infinitely delayed, end quote. After all, quote, theory cannot prolong the moment its critique depended on, end quote. Adorno. Whereas Marx, quote, who thought his own era, was right to redeem the theoretical promise of historical materialism, end quote, could still anticipate the proletarian revolution which would cause philosophy to be superseded by a transformed practice, and supposedly thereby liberate theory from a locked up and base totality. It is no longer possible for Adorno to ground his theory in a practically effective, non-identical That quote I just read was from Bremer, 1998. Following Lukács, Adorno envisioned as late as the 1930s a revolution on the part of the proletariat. However, this never materialized, and, quote, the progressive implications of the contradiction, end quote, between society and the working class, quote, disappeared, end quote. As Adorno and Horkheimer note several times in their discussions on whether and how to write a manifesto. As early as 1948, Adorno describes the changes resulting from the new situation for theory itself in a long letter to Herbert Marcuse. Quote, I'd like to avoid the misunderstanding that I want to rescue the traditional pre-Marxian concept of philosophy. That is, the ontological concept, the concept of prima philosophia in the broadest sense. Rather, I only want to stick to a strict enough concept, of what counts as, quote, theory and real theory, end quote. By philosophy, I mean nothing else. But what's at issue is more than a merely terminological argument. Unlike the philosophy professors, I don't believe at all in merely terminological quarrels. Rather, every philosophical concept has, by virtue of its historical dimension, an irreplaceable quality which cannot be solved by reference to synonyms. Instead, my motif is that we must face the situation that we are theorists, for God's sake, and not immediate practitioners. Theory needs to account for this in some way if it doesn't want to make the revolutionary action into a deus ex machina and a captatio benevolentiae. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Quote, well, I'm a theorist, but I actually mean practice, so I'm not really a theorist, but rather have theory practice and stand righteously before Lenin even when I don't have practice, end quote. I think practice is too damn serious for that. Unless there's a truly transparent dialectical relationship between practice and theory, it seems to me that theory has no right to cognitively invoke practice. Instead, it must stand on its own two legs, that is, prove itself theoretically, and in a strong sense at that. This is philosophy, after all. Just because true theory is practice doesn't mean that theory can already become practice on its own. It can't claim to be practice and no longer philosophy. At the same time, the repeated separation of theory and practice to which we find ourselves opposed must itself be theoretically determined. I think we have to face, on the one hand, what became of the labor movement, without which the strong concept of practice turns into pragmatism, and by no means in the strong sense. And on the other, the chemical changes to which the concept of practice in society as a whole is subjected. Under liberalism, theory was ideology, and practice, the proletarian kind, stood immediately opposed to it. Theory no longer exists in the world today, ... In other words, ideology, the lie in service of perpetuating what exists, has gone over to practice in the broadest sense, in whose name, that of socialist build-up, theory is liquidated beyond the Iron Curtain as well. No longer is there any sentence whatsoever to which a cui bono isn't affixed. The relationship between action and contemplation stands in the same dialectic. The theses against Feuerbach are no longer valid. Every professor will shout to us that the point is to change the world, but to first interpret the world again is something no one wants to do anymore. What resists ideology has gone over solely to what does not play along, simply helps the matter, without arranging it according to goals and thereby forcing it to conform to one of the powers, to express itself in a way which the entire world order otherwise precludes. Footnote. Translator's note. Gleichschaltung, or coordination, was a term used to designate official state policy of forced conformity of all aspects of German society to the Nazi regime. End footnote. That is, it has gone over precisely to quote pure thought, yet not in the sense of a priorism, but rather in the sense of maintaining one's purity against swearing an oath on something existing. I am well aware that this means in a certain way a regression against Marx, back to the Stoics, if you will. But this is precisely the regression of the society from which we, particularly as Marxists, are not independent. And if we have no other recourse anymore, then we should at least not speak as if the workers' battalions were booming behind our books. I believe that only by becoming conscious of this entire situation in all its complexity, and of its profound dubiousness and the danger of quietism, can we contribute our powerlessness so that the situation might change. I don't have to assure you that I do not advocate the resurrection of metaphysics just because the barricades are closed due to construction. And if against me you object that such adherence to philosophy is threatened by a relapse into conformity, I am the last who would dispute this, with the one caveat that there is simply no thought and no attitude today not faced with this threat, precisely because the world is converging into a total system, and thereby tending to absorb everything. All we can do is resist this absorption, above all I think through language, ... I mean something ... difficult to express, but very dialectical, that in the moment they happen, the decisive actions always have an aspect of hopelessness, of quote, impossibility. That is exactly the threshold to positivism, indeed to all bourgeois reason. God knows this is not to say that these actions are objectively hopeless. Then they would be pure martyrdom, which I'd want to idolize as little as you. But the absurd, quote, subjective, end quote, aspect in them cannot be skipped over. Otherwise, it would be in the bag. And the all-important qualitative leap is exactly what one does not ever, under absolutely any circumstances, have in the bag. But seriously, pursuing these things really leads to a sphere about which one can talk, but not correspond, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Marcuse, 18th of July, 1948. At any rate, as Helmut Plessner has established, Adorno, quote, has over Marx, unquote, and one might add over the Lukács of history and class consciousness, quote, the advantage of historical perspective, unquote, of having seen how proletarian revolutions put new industry bureaucrats in the saddle and kindled endless quarrels about true communism analogous to the patristic scholastic disputes following Christ. The liberation of the working class did not put an end to the interpretation of this class, but rather enlivened it to an unforeseen degree. The situation of the interregnum which philosophy has gotten into, that is, philosophy surviving its death, not uncontested, yet also not illegitimate, is where Adorno begins. End quote. Plessner. For Adorno, quote, reflection about why a practical change did not take place, end quote. The exceeding of theory and practice, quote, in other words, why practice finds itself in these difficulties or in this standstill situation, end quote. Adorno, is now the order of the day, and, quote, such reflection is itself an important part of what we can call philosophy today. In a certain sense, then, because the predicted transition from theory to practice did not take place, the interaction between theory and practice must revert to theory. End quote. Adorno. One scholarly attempt to introduce negative dialectics describes the claim Adorno asserts on philosophy therein as follows, quote, the fact that, quote, the moment to realize, end quote, philosophy, quote, was missed, end quote, should be able to determine ex negativo as a condition of possibility for philosophy's survival, end quote. Nieher, 1984. Yet this and other such descriptions are hardly half the truth. Adorno does not want to show the possibility of philosophy, but rather the necessity of turning to philosophy in times when revolutionary practice is impossible. Quote, practice endlessly postponed can no longer serve as an appellate court against philosophy. The process of reflection about why this did not happen is philosophy, end quote. Adorno. The other words, the point of philosophy should be to revise Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, to reflect on why the possibility of changing the world is temporarily foreclosed. Critique as a theoretical possibility is for the time being the only remaining possibility to address society as a whole. Settling for this is difficult at times, for, quote, distance from praxis is disreputable in the eyes of everyone. Anyone who does not take immediate action and who is not willing to get his hands dirty is the subject of suspicion. It is felt that his antipathy towards such action was not legitimate, and further that his view has even been distorted by the privileges he enjoys, end quote. Adorno. That is by the fact that many must, quote, get their hands dirty, end quote, so that a select few do not have to do so. However, if practice is pitted against the only theory currently on offer, then the concept of practice simultaneously becomes ideologically limited to, quote, increased production of the means of production, end quote. Such as was the case in the Soviet Union, where the, quote, only criticism still tolerated was that people still were not working hard enough, end quote. In this way, Adorno believes, quote, the subordination of theory to praxis results in the support of renewed repression, end quote. Adorno. What remains is a philosophy which does not affirmatively build on the most advanced form it had reached before Marx. For Adorno, this form is present in Hegel's philosophy, quote, with its attempt to comprehend the non-identical, albeit to comprehend the non-identical by identifying with it. End quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, the assertion of the identity of being and thought, which stands behind the entire philosophical tradition, has succumbed irrevocably to the protest against it. If the world were truly at one with spirit, if it were the product of spirit, permeated with spirit, this would mean with inexorable necessity that the world would be meaningful in its current form. However, that very fact, the very assertion that, as people put it, the world has a meaning, can simply not be maintained in the light of all that we have experienced in our own epoch of history. A philosophy that blinds itself to these experiences and that clings instead to the thesis of meaningfulness in epistemology and the related realm of metaphysics, without allowing itself to be deterred by the truth that the world really does not have a meaning anymore, such a philosophy really would sink to the level of idle chatter and professional reassurance worthy only of the contempt held in readiness by certain philosophical trends, such as the positivist as well as the common or garden opinions of the ordinary man. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. Quote, having broken its pledge to be as one with reality, end quote, which made in Hegel's work, quote, or at the point of bracket realities and bracket realization, end quote, which it made in the work of Marx, quote, philosophy is obliged ruthlessly to criticize itself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, on the other hand, it has to be said that the fact that the transition to practice that has been implicit in philosophy ever since Hegel has failed contains further implications that philosophy itself should be subjected to the most rigorous process of self-criticism that must self-evidently take its lead from the latest forms assumed by philosophy. I'm not thinking here of a critique of the countless irrelevant studies that appear every year as products of the academic industry and seem to have no difficulty in finding publishers and printers, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Adorno elaborates near the beginning of Negative Dialectics, quote, contradiction is not what Hegel's absolute idealism has bound to transfigure it into. Was bound to transfigure it into. It is not of the essence in a Heraclitean sense. It indicates the untruth of identity, the fact that the concept does not exhaust the thing conceived, yet the appearance of identity is inherent in thought itself, in its pure form. To think is to identify. Conceptual order is content to screen what thinking seeks to comprehend, end quote. Adorno. Negative Dialectics. Quote, we shall see, end quote, he claims in Lectures on Negative Dialectics, quote, that the thesis of the identity of concept and thing is in general the vital nerve of idealist thought, and indeed traditional thought in general. Furthermore, this assertion of the identity of concept and thing is inextricably intertwined with the structure of reality itself. And negative dialectics as critique means above all criticism of precisely this claim to identity, a claim that cannot of course be tested on every single object in a kind of bad infinity, but which certainly can be applied to the essential structures confronting philosophy, either directly or as mediated through the themes of philosophy. Furthermore, dialectics as critique implies the criticism of any hypostatization of the mind as the primary thing, the thing that underpins everything else, end quote. Adorno. This criticism wants to, quote, break imminently, in its own measure, the appearance of total identity, end quote, within the, quote, totality of cogitative definitions, end quote. Adorno. However, quote, since that totality is structured to accord with logic, whose core is the principle of the excluded middle, whatever will not fit this principle, whatever differs in quality, comes to be designated as a contradiction. Contradiction is non-identical under the aspect of identity. The dialectical (primacy) of the principle of contradiction makes the thought of unity the measure of heterogeneity. As the heterogeneous collides, with its limit, it exceeds itself. Dialectics is the consistent sense of non-identity. End quote. Adorno. Adorno does not believe that identity should be thought of as a final principle in whose name all contradictions should ultimately be transcended. After all, according to its own concept, identity is itself necessarily mediated by what it is not, by the non-identical. Quote, identity and contradiction of thought are welded together. Total contradiction is nothing but the manifested untruth of total identification. Contradiction is non-identity under the rule of law that affects the non-identical as well. The law is not a cogitative law, however, it is real. End quote. Adorno. It is the law of identity which establishes the norms for all thought and action in developed exchange society. The very rationality which this identity embodies, quote, unconscious like the transcendental subject in establishing identity by bracket exchange in bracket, remains incommensurable with the subjects it reduces to the same denominator. The subject is the subject's foe, end quote. Adorno. Consequently, Adorno defines theory as critical self-reflection on the part of the subject, without which it suffers from a, quote, constriction of, abundance, end quote, of mental experience. Quote, theory and mental experience need to interact. Theory does not contain answers to everything. Theory reacts to the world, which is faulty to the core. That what would be free from the spell of the world is not under theory's jurisdiction, end quote. Adorno. Ultimately, it is in this sense which, quote, philosophical theory means that its own end lies in its realization, end quote. Adorno. New section. Section 2. A being for the other. Quote, in other words, one could say the principle of identity is a principle of thought itself, end quote. Adorno claims in Philosophische Terminologia. A lecture course held in the summer semester of 1962 and winter semester of 1962 to 63. Adorno continues, quote, I would not hesitate to say that every principle, every tenet which can be appealed to, under which all variety is subsumed, or from which all variety can be derived, is necessarily a principle of thought. The recourse to a first, and the stem principium means first. The reduction to an all-inclusive unity is always the recourse of reduction to thought, end quote. Adorno. Against this, Adorno returns to a set of considerations already undertaken in Against Epistemology, a metacritique, regarding demystification through identification. In a passage from that work, which according to Rolf Tiedemann, quote, counts amongst the sharpest he ever wrote, end quote, Adorno comments as follows. Quote, since the philosophical first must always already contain everything, spirit confiscates what is unlike itself and makes it the same, its property. Spirit inventories it. Nothing may slip through the net. The principle must guarantee completeness, In the concept of the first already belongs to the number series. Wherever a something in Greek becomes thematic in the concept of being in Aristotelian metaphysics, number and computability are also thought, Without the idea of the many, that of the one could never be specified. In numbers is reflected the opposition of organizing and retentive spirit. to what it faces. First, spirit reduces it to indeterminacy, in order to make it the same as itself, and then determines it as the many. Of course, spirit does not yet say it is identical with or reducible back to itself, but the two are already similar. A set of unities, the many forfeits its particular, as a set of unities, the many forfeits its particular qualities, ... Numbers are an arrangement for making the non-identical, dubbed, quote, the many, commensurable with the subject, the model of unity. They bring the manifold of experience to its abstraction, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, in this view, thinking in numbers, a longing for demythologization, turns into, quote, myth, and becomes the antithesis of enlightenment. Quote, myth, ... which wants to, quote, establish, for which philosophy is, quote, homesickness, manifests itself as the greatest antithesis not only to enlightenment, but also Adorno's dialectical philosophy in general, whose home is, quote, not the lost state of old, end quote, but rather the, quote, state of having escaped, end quote. Müller-Strumsdorfer. End footnote. Counting is a process of quantification, a process which disregards the qualities of what is counted in order to transform the being in itself of things into a controllable being for others. However, the principle of being for another is precisely the genuine principle of all economy, pre-capitalist and capitalist alike. What is new under capital compared to previous economic systems is the total assertion of this principle as, quote, the absolute being for the other of the commodity world, end quote. Adorno. Quote, society has become the total functional context which liberalism used to think it was. To be is to be relative to other persons and things, and to be irrelevant in oneself, end quote. Adorno. Already in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno note that, quote, everything has value only insofar as it can be exchanged, not insofar as it is something in itself, end quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. This functionality of value, whose concept is, quote, formed in the exchange relationship, a being for the other, end quote, Adorno, is generalized by Adorno into the universal principle of exchange. In this society, quote, everything is heteronomously defined, end quote. This principle stymies the mature development of subjects who adhere to the, quote, promise of security offered by logic, identity in the absence of contradiction, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, society has become the total functional context which liberalism used to think it was. To be is to be relative to other persons and things, and to be irrelevant in oneself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, the people from the old Hegelian tradition here are the only ones immune to the spook of the void. Out of a kind of perverted need for security, all of the young ones all fall for it. Some security that A equals A and not A. And some security that A equals A and not equals not A. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 30th of October, 1936. End footnote. Quote, the criterion of the irrefutable, a property which shall not be able to be wrested away from a person, takes the place of the weight of insight. It means, indeed, the methods become ends in themselves in accordance with a society-wide tendency to give the for the other, exchange value, primacy over every in itself, every purpose, end quote. Adorno. With that, quote, objective bourgeois spirit has risen up as a replacement for philosophy. One cannot fail to recognize in this the parti pris for the exchange principle, abstracted to the norm of being for another, with which the criterion of empathetic reconstructibility and the concept of communication, ultimately formed in the culture industry, comply as the measure of all that is intellectual. End quote. Adorno. Where philosophical experience once existed, there emerges a common sense, which is not only linguistically related to what the National Socialists referred to as the gesundes Volksempfinden, literally the, quote, healthy sense of the folk, end quote, of the racially defined people, but also, quote, chooses ideological formulas which ensure subjective security, which always already have ready for everything a coherent and declarative answer, end quote. Demirovich. Footnote. Quote, and if one has to choose between the paranoid fantasy about a paranoid reality or the stupidity of common sense, one is always going to get further with paranoia, end quote. Adorno to Horkheimer, 12th of November, 1952. And footnote. Footnote. Translator's note. Gesundes Volksempfinden was a legal term in Nazi Germany. One could be prosecuted for actions viewed as going against the Gesundes Volksempfinden. End footnote. For Adorno, the totality of the principle of exchange on which society is based establishes the a priori of the commodity form's logic, according to which all things are potentially quantifiable and thus exchangeable for equivalence. Because of this a priori, things need not first, quote, prove themselves on the market, end quote, as the saying goes. Footnote. Quote, although Adorno repeatedly spoke about the exchange society, Adorno should not be described, as he so often wrongly is, as a theorist of an exchange society in the economic sense. The essence of Adorno's critical theory lies in the very fact that he understands the capitalist economy as an inverted reality, in which individuals no longer, quote, interact with one another, end quote, on the market as rationally acting subjects, as the idea of the exchange economy suggests. Adorno criticizes such a concept as, quote, social nominalism, end quote. Rather, individuals act as executors of constraints generated and reproduced by themselves, which are implemented in and through their conscious actions, yet without these being consciously accessible to them. This is what the strong concept of totality means, ... Totality is not a methodological postulate, but rather the concept of a real, quote, becoming autonomous, end quote, bracket, Verselbständigung, end bracket, end quote, Helmut Reichelt, end footnote. Rather, it is far more essential that things possess use value and value. In other words, that in addition to the qualitative state of their existence, they are also quantifiable. Under capital, which valorizes virtually everything, this logic applies to all matters. Seen in this way, history up until now presents itself as a progression toward the totality that is universal quantification. Quote, tit for tat of history. Quote, the tit for tat of history, as well as the totality-bound principle of equivalence in the social relation between individual subjects. Both proceed according to the logicity which Hegel is said merely to interpret in them. End quote. Adorno. What cannot be measured does not let itself be subsumed under identity, is not supposed to exist, have ever existed or ever come into existence. History remains prehistory, and as such it approaches a standstill. Whereas abstraction as a universal principle must sever everything from things which impedes their commensurability, the non-identical remainder is left over as a waste product of this process of abstraction. Yet insofar as abstraction, a conceptual condition of the possibility of rational knowledge, and insofar as the concept itself is a condition thereof, the only viable way to unregulated knowledge is that utopian way of, quote, unsealing the conceptual with concepts without making it their equal, end quote. Adorno, quote, the object itself is literally a concept in itself, yet it is not a concept in the sense of being the life of the absolute, but rather in the sense that it, that is, the objectively consolidated society, essentially and constitutively contains within itself a conceptual element, namely that of exchange. To this extent, one can really say, in an ironic sense, that the world in which we live is a subject-object, meaning that precisely the objectivity to which we stand opposed, the entity which appears to us as heteronymous and unintelligible, and at whose mercy we stand, this objectivity has become what it is precisely by modeling, supporting, leveling, and abstracting itself out according to a conceptuality, indeed according to the principle of exchange, end quote. Adorno. However, the non-identical does not wait unrecognized for the non-identical's discovery. As long as the, quote, insatiable identity principle, end quote, prevails, quote, the non-identical has no positive existence, end quote. Adorno. The non-identical is the governor of a knowledge which does not need to violently whip objects into shape in order to adjust itself. As long as this possibility of knowledge is not realized, everything which could possibly be different will appear as, quote, just how it's always been, end quote. Adorno, with all the forthright consent implied by that saying. As Adorno writes in Negative Dialectics, quote, what appears as the formlessness of bracket an existence, end bracket, modeled solely after subjective reason is in fact that which enslaves the subjects. The pure principle of being for something else, of being bracket a commodity, end bracket, for the sake of universal equivalence and comparability, or comparability. This principle depreciates qualitative definitions everywhere. Its tendency is to bring all things down to one level. Yet the same bracket commodity and bracket character, the indirect rule of men over other men, consolidates the subject's state of tutelage. Their coming of age and their freedom to think qualitatively would go together, end quote. Adorno. However, the mediation of subjects by other subjects is also a condition of individualization, and a virtually necessary condition at that. Quote, although all elements on the side of the universal process of exchange are made commensurable with each other, individuality is only possible given this relationship. After all, individuality is not a pure being for itself, but rather it becomes a pure being for itself in relationship to another. Thus the process of leveling is at the same time itself a process of differentiation and also of individualization. Individuality as differentiation emerges through comparability with others. End quote. Adorno. In other words, being, quote, irrelevant in oneself, end quote, is the price the individualized subject has to pay for its individuality, a concept which in turn is verging on irrelevance. If the common denominator of all subjects is their mere irreverence, this contradicts the very notion of a strong concept of individuality. From the perspective of the valorization process, individuality is now merely the valorizable form of an arbitrary substance. The individual subsists as the embodiment of its labor power, or as the owner of capital, in short, as a functionary of its respective class in the capitalist process of reproduction. But this, Adorno does not mean to suggest that the state in which individuals exist is completely socially determined. Rather, Adorno refers to individuality as a form of subject's existence, given that it is subjects subjects who are socially cultivated in order to fulfill social objectives. Quote, the act of differentiating, end quote, subjects from each other, quote, is in itself one such act of socialization. Individuation and individuality are thus an element of society, end quote. Adorno. A footnote underlined as many as 7 times in Adorno's copy of Capital reads as follows, quote, in a certain sense, a man is in the same situation as a commodity, as he neither enters into the world in possession of a mirror, nor as a Fichtean philosopher who can say, I am. A man first sees and recognizes himself in another man. Peter only relates to himself as a man through his relation to another man, Paul, in whom he recognizes his likeness. With this, however, Paul also becomes head to toe in his perfect form as Paul, the form of appearance of the species man for Peter. End quote. Marx. For Marx, the human being is not constituted as a species in its relationship to the other. Adorno himself, for whom this passage perhaps first became relevant because of his interest in Marx's concept of alienation, would subsequently go beyond its mediation between epistemology and intersubjectivity, analyzing individuality itself as the result of economic relations. Quote, bourgeois individuality is the actual, quote, substrate, end quote, of Marxian thought on social phenomena. To this extent, Marx himself is a bourgeois individualist and a product of his time. The notion that the category of the individual itself is socially produced did not yet occur to him at all. Marx believed that something like free and fair exchange between individuals, an ideology of liberalism, could be realized if people would simply behave rationally, and if production took place for society as a whole. In this vision of the individual, and of the rational behavior of all, there is of course no room for the concept of authority as a problem. Marx did not yet recognize the whole coercive mechanism to which rationality is subjected, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Regarding a student presentation to be held on Marx's concept of the individual in his seminar from the 1964 summer semester, Adorno comments, quote, that Marx hardly talks explicitly about the problem of the individual, so the presentation cannot completely clarify the status of the individual in Marxian theory. It is much rather the case that the individual in Marx's work is concealed behind other concepts, such as that of spontaneity, which means the actions of individuals, insofar as their whole existence is not identical with society's existence, end quote. Adorno. And footnote. Instead, Marx envisioned, quote, the individual as an invariant, presumably not only covered up by the coercive relations of exchange, presumably only covered up by the coercive relations of exchange, it could be set free again through their eradication. In this respect, Marx was a bourgeois liberal, end quote. Adorno. When Adorno elaborates these thoughts in his seminar, Adorno's interpretation of Marx's concept of the individual was met at the time with audible skepticism. Footnote. This skepticism was justified, for Marx in fact criticizes the establishment of the individual as a trans-historical point of departure for social development, as, quote, simple-mindedness, end quote. According to Marx, for, quote, the 18th century prophets, this 18th century individual, the product on one side of the dissolution of the feudal forms of society, on the other side of the new forces of production, developed since the 16th century, appears as an ideal, whose existence they project into the past, not as a historic result, but as history's point of departure, as the natural individual appropriate to their notion of human nature, not arising historically, but posited by nature. This illusion has been common to each new epoch to this day, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Quote, regarding several objections as to whether the individual is in fact conceived of as a constant in Marx's work, with no dialectical breakthrough, Adorno responded that Marx could not yet have seen the development in which every individual in concept was being functionalized. For him, the individual is simply bound by ties which a rational practice could loosen again. In this, Marx ignored the dialectic of individualization, that the individual itself could only be the product of a historical development rather than historical development's precondition, end quote. Adorno. Rather than view the individual as a piece of nature to be freed from its social transformation, Adorno instead foregrounds the mediation between society and nature, which Adorno also views as the mediation between the identifying concept and what evades identification. The non-identical. Identification is domination of nature. Section 3. The usefulness of a thing. In the book, The Concept of Nature in Marx, a dissertation written in the late 1950s under the supervision of Adorno and Horkheimer, the philosopher Alfred Schmidt elaborates the thesis that although Marx did not view nature and society as two separate spheres, which only seldom come into contact, Marx nevertheless considered nature to be, quote, the primary source of all instruments and objects of labor, end quote. Marx, i.e., Marx saw nature from the beginning in relation to human activity, end quote. Schmidt. However, this insight alone does not sufficiently define nature, but simply names the precondition for knowledge of nature. Nature can only be grasped as socially mediated. Nature can only be grasped as socially mediated. Marx advocates, along with Engels, granted, quote, with the critical reservation that any such priority could only exist within mediation, end quote, a, quote, priority of external nature, end quote. Marx and Engels. However, a preeminence of social subjects paradoxically results from this priority because insofar as nature is viewed as, quote, the material of human activity, end quote, it is yet again primarily assigned the status of an instrumentality, of a being for another, which exists namely for the subject. In Marx's work, the mediacy between nature and society finds expression in the dichotomy between use value and value. Marx claims on the one hand that use value is realized, quote, in use or consumption, end quote. That is, that use or consumption forms the entire intent and purpose of use value. On the other hand, Marx argues that, quote, in the form of society to be considered here, bracket, use values, and bracket, are also the material bearers of ... exchange value, end quote. Marx. Brackets in original. Precisely at this point of the account in Marx's Capital, in which it should be emphasized that, quote, the relationship between exchange value and use value is not one of subsumption, but rather of mutual preconditions and exclusions, a dialectical relationship, so to speak, end quote. Hoffner. Marx proceeds remarkably undialectically by claiming that use value and exchange value have no inner relationship to each other, and that use value falls outside the realm of economic analysis. There's two footnotes here. Footnote, quote, by means of the value relation, therefore, the natural form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A. In other words, the physical body of commodity B becomes a mirror for the value of commodity A. Commodity A, then, in entering into a relation with commodity B as an object of value, as a materialization of human labor, makes the use value B into the material through which its own value is expressed. The value of commodity A, thus expressed in the use value of commodity B, as the form of relative value, end quote. End footnote. End quote, Marx, end footnote. Footnote, quote, use value in this indifference to the determined economic form, i.e. use value as such, lies outside the sphere of investigation of political economy. It belongs in the sphere only when it is itself a determinate form, end quote. Marx. Fritz Roiswig and Jürgen Ritzert have commented on the ambiguous, quote, role or non-role of use values in the Marxian critique of political economy, end quote. Against its frequently alleged functional ambiguity, including by Marx himself, they ask, quote, how is use value related to utility and or expediency, end quote. Roiswig and Ritzert, 1991. End footnote. The contradictions which necessarily result from the identification of use value with the utility of the product of labor can only be resolved by viewing use value as the qualitative social element of the commodity, as opposed to value, its quantitative social element. Whereas the exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element, of which they represent a greater or lesser quantity, end quote. I don't know if I said the first quote, I'm going to repeat that. Whereas the, quote, exchange value of commodities must be reduced to a common element, of which they represent a greater or lesser quantity, end quote. Whereas these values are purely quantitative, the use value of a commodity can only be determined qualitatively. This situation becomes clear when Marx uses the abstraction of use values from commodities to extrapolate the substance of their values as, quote, labor, human labor in the abstract, end quote. Quote, if then we disregard the use value of commodities, end quote, Marx claims, quote, only one property remains, that of being products of labor, end quote. Marx. If, as in Marx's work, use value is regarded as utility, then once the utility of the commodities is disregarded, their useless elements still remain, elements which compose a multiplicity of properties in their own right. Yet, on the other hand, if use value is simply taken to be the qualitative element itself in the commodity, then, quote, a property, end quote, in fact resulting from abstraction, the property of, quote, being a product of labor, end quote, underhandedly becomes a qualitative property again, that is, one which does not determine value. However, there is a third possibility. If use value is seen as a qualitative commodity form, which is specific to capitalism, a form which commodities must inevitably assume, in addition to the value form, then the, quote, usefulness of a thing, end quote, can be defined by the fact that the benefit of a commodity consists of both its ability to be consumed and of its ability to represent the value of another commodity. If one disregards the, quote, use value of commodities, end quote, understood in this way, the only property use value still has is the property of being a value. In the course of the, quote, irritations, end quote, produced by Marx's ambiguous definition of use value, orthodox Marxism endeavored in a, quote, use value oriented, end quote, manner to free an allegedly ontological use value from exchange value. Footnote. Along these lines, Helmut Brentel, certainly no representative of traditional labor movement Marxism in his day, argues that the telos of the critique of political economy should be the, quote, use value oriented, nature incorporating delimitation of the concept of socialization, end quote, from what he terms the, quote, logic of labor values, end quote. Helmut Brentel, 1981. However, the, quote, logic of labor values, end quote, is also the, quote, logic of use values, end quote, which allows the law of value to claim validity in the first place. End footnote. Where the hell am I? However, in so doing, it overlooked that use value, quote, only becomes a, quote, general utility, end quote, through the self-valorization of money, end quote, that is, through capital. And that quote's from Robert Kurtz. The notion that the production of use values is principally the production of innocent, needs-fulfilling, potentially emancipatory goods amounts to the claim that the production and circulation of commodities would be morally desirable if they are not accompanied by the existence of manipulative, fraudulent exchange values. In this way, use value becomes a subjective functional concept. The notion of an emancipatory, quote, use value orientation, end quote, must evidently assume that every commodity per se comes with a, quote, emancipatory use value, end quote. That is, with the possibility of providing a non-capitalist utility. Yet the utility of weapons, deportation centers, instruments of torture, and the like is based not only on the production of death, suffering, and horror, but also on maintaining and entrenching the dominant order. No theory of reification is needed to recognize this, for all these aspects of utility are germane to the production of these commodities. They are produced to kill, deport, and torture people. The association or even equation of use value and utility forecloses the possibility of inquiring into the concrete substance of, quote, utility. While necessitating the categorical establishment of a, quote, utility in itself, end quote. However, this latter kind of utility, quote, not only does not exist, but also cannot exist, for it contradicts what the concept of utility designates. This concept is constituted as a relation with two sides, a particular need and a particular quantity of an object, which bears the title of use object because of this quality. Just as different human needs are qualitatively different in substance from each other, the use objects for satisfying these needs differ from each other in their usefulness. End quote. Dunn, 1984. Quote, tellingly, the notion of pure utility, visible in the utilitarian theories, first develops when the production of commodities has more or less asserted itself in society and the last remainder of Aristotelianism, in the sense of the notion of a determination inherent in the specific thing, has disappeared, end quote. Hoffner, 1993. And footnote. The Marxian definition of use value as the, quote, usefulness of a thing, end quote, is only accurate in a value-producing society whose precondition and result are use values themselves. Joan Robinson notes the immediacy between use value and exchange value when Joan Robinson claims that, quote, utility is a metaphysical concept of impregnable circularity. Utility is the quality in commodities that makes individuals want to buy those commodities. And the fact that individuals want to buy commodities shows that those commodities have utility. End quote. Joan Robinson. Footnote. Michael Heinrich uses this quotation to dismantle the topos of economic marginalism, namely the possibility of estimating individual utility based on existing relationships of exchange. Quote, tracing exchange value back to utility is simply a claim which cannot be proved. Fundamentally, the theory of marginal utility says nothing more than that someone expects more from an exchange he enters into than from one he refuses, end quote. Heinrich. End footnote. Even Marx's statement that various use values correspond to, quote, different forms of useful labor, end quote, does not lead out of this logical dilemma. For the utility of labor would be that it produces use values which are useful in the first place. Labor, which is supposed to explain the utility of use value, can itself only be identified as useful in reference to the use value of labor power. The use value of labor power is that it produces use values. Exchange value and use value determine each other. Quote, a commodity can only ... become a use value if that commodity is realized as an exchange value, while it can only be realized as an exchange value if it is alienated and functions as a use value. End quote. Marx. Therefore, the fetishization of the exchange value is at the same time also the fetishization of use value. Quote, the salient point of fetishism is that both sides can always only be superseded at the same time. ... Use value as well as simultaneously an abstraction of a commodity. ... The entire dichotomous concept should be abolished for the benefit of something which can only be created in the process of abolition. End quote. Marcel Stutzler. In relation to Adorno's concept of the fetish character in music, this also means that Marx's emancipatory power to, quote, contradict the enchained society through unchained art, end quote, Adorno, cannot be regained by, quote, redeeming, end quote, use value from the commodity. End footnote. I should say that it just says Stutzler here, so I'm assuming it's Marcel Stutzler, but it could be someone else named Stutzler, so I shouldn't say precisely that it was Marcel Stutzler. Formulated differently, use value and exchange value are historically specific elements of capitalist society, which is why, quote, even the analysis of use value of the commodity must already make use of others as functional concepts, and on this level is already dependent on the categories of essence and appearance. End quote. Bachhaus. Specifically, this analysis relies on the distinction between the capitalist essence of use value and the manifestation of use value as usefulness, which appears to hold out for the prospect of a world beyond the exchange of commodities. Cornelia Hoffner's accusation of, quote, use value fetishism, end quote, is thus quite justified. After all, if commodities pass the, quote, form of a use value, ... by nature, end quote, parenthesis, quote, it is their natural form, end quote, end parenthesis. This is the case, quote, only for another commodity, end quote. That is, only in the exchange relation, which in turn requires the existence of exchange values. Use value, quote, does not have a real existence as such, but rather an existence only within the opposition of use value and value, end quote. Port, 1995. I think that's Wolfgang Port, but it could be another Port. Although he does not draw the decisive consequences, Marx too is thoroughly aware of the historicity of use value as such. Quote, if, quote, the value, end quote, of the commodity is only a specific historical form of something which exists in all forms of society, then so is the, quote, use value, end quote, of the commodity, end quote. Marx. Consequently, quote, use value as a manifestation is also the historical form of an essentially social form. Material substance as such is not use value. Rather, use value merely contains a, quote, natural element, end quote. Marx. The only things which can meaningfully be described as use values are those whose utility constitutes an element of society, which is to say that use value is itself a purely formal concept with an arbitrary relationship to the various qualities to which it is applied. Its, quote, discovery, end quote, is, quote, the work of history, end quote, as is claimed in Marx's Capital. Use value is not only, quote, use value as such, end quote, but it is also, quote, determined economic form, end quote. Determined economic form, end quote. And as such, it again enters into the, quote, sphere of investigation of political economy, end quote. Footnote. Uli Krug has reached a quite similar conclusion, albeit via another path. Quote, use value is possessed not by the world, preserved in the world's natural or habitual state, but rather by the one made useful, whose potentiality was awakened from its sleeping beauty slumber. Capital itself sets use value, end quote. Uli Krug. End footnote. New section, section 4, Metabolism. Adorno addresses the problems involved with the Marxian concept of nature in philosophische Terminologie. According to Adorno, this concept, quote, necessarily relates to nature in Marx's work, although the concept of, quote, nature, in which productivity is executed, itself remains undeveloped in its own right, just as it does in the famous expression, quote, metabolism with nature, end quote. It may well be assumed that Marx, with quite considerable reason, paused in his dialectical reflection precisely when confronted with the concept of nature in order to avoid grasping this concept, which for him designated the element which cannot purely be dissolved in the subject, that is, into human labor, as yet again constituted by humans. He apparently did not want to draw it into identity thinking again. While there is no natural philosophy from Marx per se, nature itself still has a philosophical meaning for him. I would in any case assume, end quote. Adorno. Adorno takes specific issue with the term, quote, metabolism with nature, end quote, according to which it is necessary to bring nature under, quote, collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power, accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy and in conditions most worthy and appropriate for their human nature, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx continues as follows, quote, but this always remains a realm of necessity, the true realm of freedom. The development of human powers as an end in itself begins beyond it, although it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. The reduction of the working day is the basic prerequisite, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Adorno, quote, cannot positively accept, end quote, it. As for Adorno, quote, a society is first humane when it no longer stands under the law of metabolism, end quote. Adorno. Here, quote, metabolism, end quote, means the social deterioration of nature, the social process which is, quote, neither purely social nor purely natural, end quote, but rather, quote, an exchange between man and nature, a permanent interaction between the two, end quote. Adorno. Adorno himself depicts the interconnection between society and nature in a highly remarkable passage in Negative Dialectics. Quote, the ineffable part of utopia is that what defies subsumption under identity, the, quote, use value, end quote, in Marx's terminology, is necessary anyway if life is to go on at all, even under the prevailing circumstances of production. The utopia extends to the sworn enemies of its realization. Regarding the concrete utopian possibility, dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. The right state of things would be free of. Dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. The right state of things would be free of it. What's it? An ontology? Neither a system nor a contradiction. End quote. Adorno. This passage constitutes a relatively late addition to the writing of the text, one revised by Adorno only once, a departure from his usual writing habits. Footnote. The revision of the passage looks as follows. Italics correspond to handwritten additions. Strike-throughs were also made by hand. Quote, I'm not going to try to actually read this because it's has a bunch of scratches out and kind of I don't know. I feel like verbalizing it would be impossible. So I'm moving on. End footnote. It is remarkable because at first glance it suggests that Marx's use value and the non-identical could be defined in reference to each other, even though the non-identical is precisely supposed to resist all positive definitions. Footnote: a quite similar statement can be seen in the 1965 lecture titled "Functionalism Today," when Adorno speaks of, quote, the bit of freedom, end quote, living, quote, even in the false needs of a human being, end quote, a freedom, quote, expressed in what economic theory once called the, quote, use value, end quote, as opposed to the bracket abstract, end bracket, quote, exchange value, end quote, Adorno. End footnote. In his essay, Rein ne va plus, Wolfgang Port's Theorie des Gebrauchswerts, nothing goes anymore, Wolfgang Port's theory of use value, Kolja Lindner addresses the apparent conflation of the non-identical and use value when he comments that in Adorno's work, use value is incorrectly but nevertheless, quote, consequently regarded as what does not let itself be subsumed under identity, end quote. Kolja Lindner. Footnote. Although Lindner's essay bears the subtitle Wolfgang Port's Theorie des Gebrauchswerts, Wolfgang Port's theory of use value, Kolja Lindner often lumps together the theories of Port and Adorno, so that at times it is hard to distinguish which one is meant or whether both are meant at the same time. Lindner's text is methodologically prototypical as well, insofar as he simply measures Port against Marx, only to criticize Port when he deviates from Marx. For example, one passage argues that Port's, quote, speculative Marx philology turns out here to be simply irreconcilable with the Marxian text, unquote. Kolja Lindner. Whether this might indicate a deficiency of Marxian theory seems at least to be debatable, and not something which can be dictated from on high. End footnote. In fact, the situation is precisely the opposite. Adorno does not derive use value from the non-identical, but rather takes the, quote, use in Marx's concept of use value as a model for how his own concept of the non-identical should be understood. This certainly constitutes a derivation from Marx's employment of the concept of use value, in spite of Adorno's claims to the contrary. However, this means neither that Adorno identifies the non-identical with use value, nor that Adorno lacks a specifically economic understanding of use value. Rather, it appears Adorno does not consider that the concept of use value is only conditionally suited as a model of the non-identical, insofar as use value stands opposed to exchange value. As a non-quantifiable, purely qualitative element, it can indeed be viewed as occupying an analogous position to the non-identical, in that the latter's relationship to the identical. That being said, use value designates what is qualitative in commodities under capitalist relations of production, whereas the non-identical, an epistemological category, applies to all possible conceivable things, not only to those things which first became commodities under capital. The analogy between use value and the non-identical completely fails when use value is regarded as the embodiment of usefulness, as it is by Marx when he claims in a contribution to the critique of political economy that, quote, One and the same use value can be used in various ways, end quote, but that, quote, the extent of its possible applications is limited by its existence as an object with distinct properties, end quote. Marx. That being said, quote, applications, end quote, are exactly what Adorno does not have in mind when he invokes the non-identical. For Adorno, if one wants to do justice to a thing, then subsuming this thing into the, quote, extent of its possible applications, end quote, is precisely what one cannot do. Opposed to this, Adorno's non-identical designates the element, which eludes fungibility. Here, Adorno vacillates between two definitions of use value. On the one hand, in analogy to the non-identical, use value is construed as non-substantive. Yet on the other, Adorno suggests that use value as a, quote, part of nature, end quote, is in a certain sense co-opted by exchange value. This latter construal backslides into the critique of political economy's capitalism-specific concept of exchange, whereas the reference to the difference between the identical and the non-identical demands the meta-economic, extra-capitalist concept of exchange already employed elsewhere by Adorno. Contrary to Kolya-Lindner, negative dialectics does not conceptualize, quote, identity logic as the capitalist form of thought par excellence, one whose model is exchange, end quote. Lindner. Although Adorno does claim that the principle of exchange is, quote, fundamentally akin to the principle of identification, end quote, and that exchange itself is, quote, the social model of the principle, end quote, Adorno, the exchange presented by Adorno as a model here is not the specifically capitalist exchange relation. Footnote. Adorno's thesis in this passage, quote, it is through exchange that non-identity prevails and performances become commensurable and identical, end quote. Adorno is the subject of a vehement critique by Cornelia Hofner, quote, opposed to Marx, whose argumentation here gives itself over to the power of negativity by showing that this commensurability is appearance, by destroying this appearance and thereby coming to the realization that what is primary is not commodity exchange, as liberal models suggest, but rather money as a universal commodity, as necessarily the resultant precondition of the exchange process. Adorno adamantly adheres to the, quote, exchange principle, end quote, and claims commensurability is something manufactured, even if it is something which is wrong and coercive towards humans and things under its authority. The proliferation of this principle constrains the entire world to the identical, to totality, end quote. Cornelia Hofner. However, nowhere in the passage is mention made of a, quote, exchange principle, end quote, molding the world into an identical totality. What is at issue is the principle of identity, or with respect to the economy, the principle of equivalence. Moreover, Adorno is not interested here in whether commodities could be exchanged for other commodities. It says of money, might be, I don't know, it seems like it should say or money, but rather in the fact that exchange takes place, that it is equivalent. End footnote. Rather, it is meta-economic exchange in general. Like the logic of identity, exchange does not first come into being with capitalism, but instead exists as the, quote, age-old myth, end quote, of, quote, an eye for an eye, a quid pro quo, end quote. Adorno. It has the same origin as the logic of identity insofar as both are mediated by each other in the quid pro quo. Neither is possible nor even conceivable without the other. In his lecture course, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Adorno emphasizes that in myth, defined as the, quote, idea that nothing new should come into being, end quote, The exchange relation is already established, also with respect to knowledge. In other words, in the, quote, equation of binding truth with timeless or eternal knowledge, end quote, the notion comes into effect that, quote, the act of cognition is a kind of exchange in which equivalents, namely efforts and products, are exchanged so that debts are settled and the sums work out. There is a relationship of equivalence such that in principle, nothing can emerge without entering into it. That is, nothing that does not have to be paid for by whatever first has first been posited. And in the process, only this exchange relation of knowledge, that is, the effort, the exchange between the labor of thinking and the object which thought then appropriates, and the products of this process, namely the fact that ideas work out, only this becomes the thing that endures, the lasting product, end quote. Adorno. In philosophische Terminologie, Adorno wagers a definition of use value in spite of his skepticism towards such practices. Quote, use value is the value which some object in its concrete form has for human beings, end quote. However, as Adorno immediately elaborates, quote, you will later see that this concept, which could possibly be described as a system-transcendent concept of value, takes a highly surprising turn, end quote. Adorno designates use value as, quote, system-transcendent, end quote, in distinction to exchange value, which, quote, could be referred to as a, quote, system-immanent, end quote, concept of value, end quote. Because in Marx's work, it functions among other ways by binding the system, or capitalist society, to nature. When Adorno speaks of the, quote, highly surprising turn, end quote, taken by use value, a term which consists of the fact that the use value of the commodity of labor power can explain the production of surplus value, Adorno thereby indicates the difficulties caused by regarding use value as a product of transforming what is external to society, namely nature. The commodity of labor power is the only commodity which emerges and reproduces itself in the consumption of use values. However, rather than being immediately given, these use values are themselves products of society, manufactured by the very labor power they nourish. The attempt to establish the dependence of use values on a nature external to society becomes lost in an infinite regression. Footnote, quote, although a use value emerges from the labor process in the form of a product, other use values, products of previous labor, enter into it as a means of production. The same use value is both the product of a previous process and a means of production in a later process. Products are therefore not only results of labor, but also labor's essential conditions, end quote. Marx. This passage is underlined in Adorno's copy of Capital. End footnote. Adorno elaborates further with the help of a quotation from Capital. Quote, the product of the process of labor is an exchange value. The product of the process of labor is a use value. A natural substance adopted to human needs through a change in form. Here the concept of nature is indeed already grasped in the sense of, one could say philosophically, a constitutum, something similarly tangible, similarly present, is, for example, the object of the natural sciences, where reflection about this object's constitution itself is either severed or has already been discarded ab ovo. There again, this reflection is namely itself conceptualized as a function of the process of labor. Quote, labor has become bound up in labor's object, end quote, namely with the natural substance. Quote, labor has been objectified, the object has been worked on, what on the side of the worker appeared in the form of unrest now appears on the side of the product in the form of being, as a fixed, immobile characteristic. The worker has spun, and the product is a spinning, end quote. As an aside, here you can see very clearly what is meant by Marxian materialism's constantly recurring concept of congealing or objectified labor. Yet at the same time, fully in keeping with Hegel, this congealed labor is not conceived of as something purely subjective, but as something already mediated by subject and object. It is conceived as something which contains in itself the labor of the subject, as well as the natural material on which this labor is performed. This became extraordinarily important in Marx's polemic against the Lassalleans, who misappropriated exactly this natural element. Marx polemicized against the famous saying that labor is the source of all wealth in the critique of the Gotha program. End quote. Adorno. Marx writes as follows, quote, labor is not the source of all wealth, not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and surely these are what make up material wealth, as labor. Labor is itself only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. This phrase can be found in any children's primer. It is correct insofar as it is assumed that labor is performed with the objects and instruments necessary to it. A socialist program, however, cannot allow such bourgeois formulations to silence the conditions which give them the only meaning they possess. Man's labor only becomes a source of use values, and hence also of wealth, if man's relation to nature, the primary source of all instruments and objects of labor, is one of ownership from the start, and if he treats it as belonging to him. There's every good reason for the bourgeoisie to ascribe supernatural creative power to labor, for when a man has no property other than his labor power, it is precisely labor's dependence on nature that forces him, in all social and cultural conditions, to be the slave of other men who have taken the objective conditions of labor into their own possession. He needs their permission to work, and hence their permission to live, end quote. Marx. End footnote. In Critique of the Gotha program, Marx correctly asserts against the customary litany of (vulgar) and (socialist) that labor is, quote, not the sole source of social wealth, end quote. In doing so, Adorno argues in Negative Dialectics, quote, Marx was philosophically at a time when the official philosophical thematics lay already behind him, saying no less than that labor could not be hypostatized in any form, neither in the form of diligent hands nor in that of mental production. Such hypostasis merely extends the illusion of the predominance of the productive principle. It comes to be true only in relation to that non-identical (element) which Marx in his disdain for epistemology called first by the crude, too narrow name of, quote, nature, end quote, later only by that of, quote, natural material, end quote, and by other less incriminated terms, end quote. Adorno. Adorno continues in Philosophische Terminologie with another quotation from Capital, quote, if we look at the whole process from the point of view of its results, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and objects of labor, end quote. Sorry, let me repeat that. Adorno continues in Philosophische Terminologie with another quotation from Capital. Quote, if we look at the whole process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the object of labor, end quote, Marx, not only the hammer, but also the raw material, quote, are means of production and that the labor itself is productive labor, end quote. Marx. I can only present the central materialist element in this without drawing out its full consequences and essentially philosophical meaning. Productive labor in Marx's work means first of all only labor which produces material goods of one kind or another, because according to Marx's definition, labor must be done to a natural material, that is, to something non-conscious, end quote. Adorno. Adorno continues as follows, quote, there are passages in Capital which take this materialist motif, I want to say, to the limits of the absurd, to the limits of paradoxical, by using productive worker to refer only to someone who in the most narrow sense is engaged in the productive apparatus of material goods, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, in contemporary society these questions are, quote, rife with problems of the most difficult kind, due to the neurotization undergone by consciousness in response to Marx. They have still not really been addressed, end quote. Adorno. Quote, I believe, end quote, Adorno comments earlier in Philosophie und Soziologie, quote, it would be a no less riveting task, if one wanted to seriously take it up some day, to pursue what the materialist motif is in Marx's work itself, and how it differs from vulgar materialist views. Today, all of this is almost fully covered over. In the East, one has developed out of Marx something like a materialist worldview, which strictly contradicts the text. As a reaction against this, and certainly to a very great extent, it has been attempted in the Western sphere to do away with the actual materialist element. In Marx's work, this element is really quite difficult to define. I would take up the task myself unless a special study were available. I wouldn't take up the task myself unless a special study were available. The attempt made above all, with the aid of Marx's early writings, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and the, quote, German ideology, to attribute to Marx something like an anthropology simply stands in contradiction to Marx. His writings against Feuerbach reject exactly this anthropological intention. Under this false alternative, the problem of what the concept of materialism in Marx's work actually is has been fully covered up until now. To realize this problem by getting to work on the texts themselves, without apologetic intentions towards one side or the other, would be a first step. Yet it is like things are jinxed with Marx. There is apparently no human being who can simply take hold of these texts without them starting to totter either to the right or left, and a genuine relationship to these texts according to their untruth content is an extraordinary rare breed, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Nevertheless, Adorno maintains that, quote, in the form of science, even spirit has become a force of production, end quote, and, quote, intervenes in the historical process. Those who claim Marx dismissed spirit as a chimera must be opposed, end quote. Adorno. According to Adorno, Marx in Marx's own time, quote, opposed idealism by asserting that it is not consciousness which determines being, but being consciousness, and that the truth about society is to be found not in its idealistic notions of itself, but in its economy, end quote. Adorno. In doing so, Marx exposed the discourse about autonomy of spirit as ideology. In his lecture course, Philosophie und Soziologie, Philosophy and Sociology, on the summer semester of 1960, Adorno comments that within the alleged autonomy of spirit, quote, the class character of society itself is here ignored or repressed. So the actual existing relations of domination are legitimized through the intrinsic and unconditional right of the mind to control or subjugate all that is. Thus, among the arguments offered in defense of the existing relations of production, you will constantly encounter the idea that it just happens there are clever people and stupid people, and the supposedly clever people, namely the ones with better minds, have justifiably higher claims and expectations than the others. These arguments, and others like them, are the last remaining dregs, as it were, from this momentous historical process in which the mind has asserted its complete independence of physical labor, and since these dregs are all that remain, the thesis in question looks like an extremely suspect and problematic one, which has been well and truly contained in the process. End quote. Adorno. Among other ways, Marx and Engels responded to this thesis with the assertion that, quote, consciousness, bracket, das Bewusstsein, or das Bewusstsein, can never be anything else than conscious being, bracket, das bewusste Sein, bracket. And the being of men is their actual life process, end quote. Marx and Engels. Describing the situation as it appeared to him at the end of the 1940s, Adorno writes that, quote, the definition of consciousness in terms of being has become a means of dispensing with all consciousness which does not conform to existence. The objectivity of truth, without which the dialectic is inconceivable, is tacitly replaced by vulgar positivism and pragmatism, ultimately, that is, by bourgeois subjectivism, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, in the rigid, quote, opposition of base and superstructure, of material and mind, end quote, there is already, quote, an element of stasis, and indeed of reification, which Marx criticizes as ideological, end quote. Adorno. Adorno argues that Marx's concept of productive labor, the concept to which the discourse on forces of production refers, is in fact, quote, quite complicated because it is already taken from the rules of the game of bourgeois society, and one could almost say that it is a parody of what Marx himself might have imagined as productivity, end quote. Adorno. After all, quote, where is the concept of productivity in bourgeois society? One may say here, is ideologized, glorifying of labor. This concept of productivity is in reality only limited to valorizability. In contrast, on the one hand, Marx wrests labor away from this ideology, yet while Marx himself does not perceive labor according to its valorizability, he does perceive it according to its utility. This utility, however, this is extraordinarily important, and I point it out to you as a great heresy against official Marxism, must not be a utility at all. To illustrate this, I present to you one of the most altogether astounding passages I am familiar with in Marx's work, a passage which was just pointed out to me a few days ago. Here you can see behind the scenes, so to speak, and recognize what is actually meant by materialism, end quote. Adorno. Adorno then cites a passage from Marx's Results of the Immediate Process of Production, which is on this channel in like a very long 8-hour video, but it's worth listening to if you like sitting for 8 hours. I decided after I made that video that I'm never doing that again. I'm only making videos. I'm trying to keep my videos shorter, but it's a tremendous piece. Adorno then cites a passage from Marx's Results of the Immediate Process of Production. Quote, from the foregoing, it is evident that for labor to be designated productive, qualities are required, end quote. Marx. Always system-immanent qualities, quote, which are utterly unconnected with the specific content of the labor, with its particular utility or the use value in which it is objectified, end quote. Marx. So this is quite different from how productive labor was defined in Capital. Quote, hence labor with the same content can be either productive or unproductive, end quote. Marx. And now comes the astounding part. Quote, for instance, Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, was an unproductive worker, end quote. Marx. This means he created no exchange value by doing so, that it wasn't valorizable. Quote, on the other hand, a writer who turns out work for his publisher in factory style, end quote. Marx. So, for example, the writer of trash films who produced some wretched scripts for Hollywood, which are completely ideological and worthless, quote, is a productive worker. Milton produced Paradise Lost as a silkworm produces silk, as the activation of Milton's own nature. Milton later sold his product for £5 and thus became a merchant, but the literary proletarian of Leipzig, who produces books such as Compendia on Political Economy, at the behest of his publisher, is pretty nearly a productive worker, since his production is taken over by capital and only occurs in order to increase capital. A singer who sings like a bird is an unproductive worker. If she sells her song for money, she is to that extent a wage laborer or merchant. But if the same singer is engaged by an entrepreneur who makes her sing to make money, then she becomes a productive worker, since she produces capital directly, end quote. Marx. From this passage, it really emerges that all the categories of bourgeois society, represented here by productivity, in the sense understood by the principle of exchange. So, in other words, the whole system which Marx develops is not supposed to be a system of absolute or truth. I don't know if it's supposed to say knowledge or it's just, I think it's a typo. Or, I don't know. It's not supposed to be a system of the absolute. Oh, never mind. Shit. I fucked that up. So, in other words, the whole system which Marx develops is not supposed to be a system of the absolute or of truth. It is, much rather, the case that Marx wants to show that in fact the whole ... is the untrue. Hence, it is an utter perversion that out of so-called dialectical materialism, something like a system has been made in the name of diamot. End quote. Footnote, translator's note, Stalinist shorthand for dialectical materialism. And obviously that quote is from Adorno. Oh, the quote continues. Sorry, on to the next page. My bad. Carrying on. I would say that the question of understanding Marx first begins where this curious refraction emerges. It is, however, evident that behind the Marxian concept of productivity, there is a notion which does in fact go far beyond the concept of mere material production. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Along these lines, Adorno speaks in a semester of, quote, Marx, who referred to socially useful labor as that which is paid for on the market, according to the laws of the market. However, Milton would not have performed socially useful labor for his work Paradise Lost, sold for absurdly little money. Through this example, Marx immediately places the concepts functional and dysfunctional under irony. He delivers eminent criteria for what is organic and non-organic to a society, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. New section. Section 5. Total Mediation. That the Marxian concept of productivity... Okay. That the Marxian concept of productivity cannot be reduced to material production becomes evident in view of the concepts of first and second nature. Alfred Schmidt summarizes these concepts as follows, quote, Hegel describes first nature, a world of things existing outside men, as blind conceptless occurrence. The world of men as it takes shape in the state, law, society, and the economy is for him, quote, second nature, end quote, manifested reason, objective spirit. Marxist analysis opposes to this the view that Hegel's, quote, second nature should rather be described in the terms he applied to the first, namely, as the area of conceptlessness, where blind necessity and blind chance coincide. The, quote, second nature, end quote, is still the, quote, first, end quote. End quote. Alfred Schmidt. By contrast, having adopted the concept of, quote, second nature from Lukács, who himself adopted it from Hegel, Adorno does not simply define, quote, second nature as, quote, first. Rather, Adorno insists on the, quote, immanence of first and second nature, end quote. Given that a, quote, pure nature, that is to say, nature that has not gone through the mediation process of society, does not exist, end quote. Adorno. At the same time, this also means that, quote, first nature, end quote, is already, quote, second nature, end quote. Quote, Hegel already gave a rating of greater substantiality to the results of abstraction. Under the name topos, Hegel deals with matter, also with the transition to existence. That its concept is indefinite, that is a concept that lacks precisely what is meant by it, is supposed to be why all light is cast on its form. Hegel fits this into Western metaphysics at its outermost limits. Engels saw that, but came to the opposite, equally undialectical conclusion that matter is the first being. Dialectical criticism is due to the concept of the first being itself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, Adorno's critique of Hegel builds on his own concept, oriented on Lukács's theory of the novel, of, quote, second nature, as is elaborated in his early manifesto for the philosophy of history, titled The Idea of Natural History. There it is claimed that, quote, second nature is in truth first nature, end quote. End footnote. No first nature is in sight as long as history is natural history, and in this respect prehistory. The fact that nature no longer exists also means that everything, even society itself, is only nature. That even the non-identical does not positively exist, is only negatively recognizable. Since the human beings have existed, that is, since the separation between subject and object, nature has been available for them to dominate. Footnote. Between November 1932 and August 1933, Adorno wrote the libretto for a light opera he was planning, titled Der Schatz des Indianer Joe, The Treasure of Indian Joe. In one scene, a protagonist named Young Tom looks out of the entrance of an enormous dripstone cave and says, quote, how the forest outside looks through the gray gate before the cave, completely different, as if it were artificially depicted, like no real forest at all, end quote. Tiedemann offers a convincing interpretation of this passage, quote, that there is no right life, bracket, richtiges Leben, in the wrong one, is expressed thusly in Indianer Joe, quote, there is no real nature where society is false, end quote. Tiedemann. End footnote. However, theoretically speaking, this means that all nature is available for them. In practical terms, this availability is expanded by technological advancement, which knows neither unavailability nor non-identity. This also explains the, quote, difficulty of positively defining first nature, end quote. Adorno. Quote, end quote, Duarte, Duarte, 1989. Quote, but the second nature, philosophically raised again for the first time in Lukács's theory of the novel, remains the negation of any nature that might be conceived as the first. What is truly, some word in Greek, produced by the functional context of individuals, if not by themselves, usurps the insignia of that which a bourgeois consciousness regards as nature and as natural. To that consciousness, nothing appears as being outside anymore. In a certain sense, there actually is nothing outside anymore, nothing unaffected by total mediation. What is trapped within, therefore, comes to appear to itself as its own otherness, a primal phenomenon of idealism. The more relentlessly socialization commands all moments of human and interhuman immediacy, the smaller the capacity of men to recall that this web has evolved, and the more irresistible its natural appearance. The appearance reinforces the distance between human history and nature. Keeps growing. Nature turns into an irresistible parable of imprisonment. The youthful Marx expressed the unending entwinement of the two elements with an extremist vigor, bound to irritate dogmatic materialists. Quote, "We know only a single science, the science of history. History can be considered from two sides, divided into the history of nature and the history of mankind. Yet there is no separating the two sides. As long as men exist, natural and human history will qualify each other." End quote. Marx. The traditional antithesis of nature and history is both true and false. True insofar as the traditional antithesis of nature and history expresses what happened to the natural element. False insofar as, by means of conceptual reconstruction, the traditional antithesis of nature and history apologetically repeats the concealment of history's natural growth. End quote. Adorno. When Adorno refers to, quote, "wars or similar natural catastrophes of society," end quote, he decisively appropriates, quote, Marx's polemical concept of natural (law), end quote. Which characterizes capitalist production. In the introduction to Capital, Marx writes the following, quote, "Even when a society has begun to track down the natural laws of its movement, and is the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society, it can neither leap over the natural phases of its development nor remove them by degree. But it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. ... I do not by any means depict the capitalist and the landowner in rosy colors, but individuals are dealt with here only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, the bearers of particular class relations and interests. My standpoint, from which the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for the relations whose creature he remains. Socially speaking, however, much he may subjectively raise himself above them." End quote. Marx. Adorno cites this passage in Negative Dialectics. Quote, "What is meant here," end quote, Adorno comments, quote, "is certainly not Feuerbach's anthropological concept of nature, against which Marx aimed dialectical materialism in the sense of a Hegelian reprise against the left Hegelians. The so-called law of nature that is merely one of capitalist society, after all, is therefore called, quote, mystification," end quote, by Marx, end quote. When Marx refers to the, quote, law of capitalist accumulation, mystified by the economists into a supposed law of nature, end quote. Marx. Quote, "There is a contradiction here. On the one hand, Marx speaks of the scientist's passion of the inexorable laws of nature, in particular the evolution of the laws of economics. At the same time, however, these laws are shown to be mystifications, an illusion," end quote. Adorno. After all, the, quote, organic nature of capitalist society is both an actuality and at the same time a socially necessary illusion. The illusion signifies that within this society laws can only be implemented as natural processes over people's heads, while their validity arises from the form of the relations of production within which production takes place, end quote. Adorno. This means that, quote, natural history, in Marx's work, quote, in contrast to the naturalist approach of vulgar Marxism, is a critical concept, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, "There is a passage from Foundations of Political Economy," I'm pretty sure he's referring here to Grundrisse, "that leaves no doubt that Marx's view of natural history was critical in essence. Quote, much as the whole of this motion appears as a social process, much as the single moments of this motion take their departure from the conscious will and from particular purposes of individuals, the totality of the process does appear as an objective context arising by natural growth. It is indeed due to the interaction of conscious individuals but neither seated in their consciousness nor subsumed under them as a whole, end quote. Marx. Such a social concept of nature has a dialectic of its own. The thesis that society is subject to natural laws is ideology if it is hypostatized as immutably given by nature. But this legality is real as a law of motion for the unconscious society, as Marx's Capital, in a phenomenology of the anti-spirit, traces it from the analysis of the commodity form, to the theory of collapse. The changes from each constitutive economic form to the next occurred like those of the animal types that arose and died out over millions of years. The fetish chapters, quote, theological quirks of the commodity, end quote, mock the false consciousness in which the social relation of the exchange value is reflected to contradicting parties as a quality of things in themselves. But those quirks are also as true as the practice of bloody idolatry was once a fact. For the constitutive forms of socialization, of which that mystification is one, maintain their absolute supremacy over mankind as if they were divine providence, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. This means that, quote, natural history in Marx's work, quote, in contrast to the naturalist approach of vulgar Marxism, is a critical concept, end quote. Adorno. Quote, human history, the history of the progressing mastery of nature, continues the unconscious history of nature, of devouring and being devoured. Ironically, Marx was a social Darwinist. What the social Darwinists praise, what they would like to go by, is to Marx the negativity, which within itself awakens, the chance of voiding, itself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, with considerations such as these, Adorno stands in pointed contrast to Marx. Although Marx was not the enthusiastic proponent of industrialism some would like to declare Marx, domination over nature appeared to Marx, at least in his later years, to be necessary and largely unproblematic, end quote. Schiller, 1993. End footnote. Social Darwinism, the, quote, hopeless rhythm of coming to be and passing away, or of eating and being eaten, end quote, is a rhythm in which, quote, nothing changes, end quote. Quote, the historical link between predator and prey is essentially unhistorical, end quote. Adorno. In the words of Adorno from one of his seminars, the, quote, brilliance of Marx lies in the fact that although Marx conceives of history as a continuation of natural history, he opposes precisely the condition in which Darwinism becomes elevated to a worldview. His critique of political economy is one of the heteronymous dominations. His critique of political economy is one of the heteronymous domination of relations of production, a domination from which human beings should liberate themselves, end quote. End quote, Adorno. However, this liberation would not deliver human beings to infinitely redeemed use values, but rather from capitalism altogether, including from its elementary categories of value and use value. Thus, Kolja Lindner concedes to critical theory, again referring to Adorno, quote, that in spite of all logic of subsumption, the diagnosis of a use value fully incorporated by capital remains ambivalent. This is not only due to the various versions and context in which it has been presented in over 25 years of theoretical work, but also Adorno's iridescent conception of society. Society is said to be a totality that subsumes use value. yet also a, quote, ongoing antagonism, end quote, ... which entails the possibility of overcoming totality, ... For the context in question here, this is important insofar as there exists in Adorno's work the hope that social confrontation might topple the existing totality of relations of production and release use values from their social bracketing, bringing the emancipatory potential of use values to bear, as long as they have such potential, in the sense of something which serves the well-being of humanity. End quote. Kolja Lindner. From this, Lindner concludes that, quote, for Adorno, the idea of freedom first emerges in a certain capitalist stage in the development of the forces of production, namely after necessary labor has been reduced to a vanishingly small minimum, potentially eradicating humanity's material deprivation, end quote. Kolja Lindner. Insofar as Lindner means by this that only under the above circumstances does the possibility of freedom exist for Adorno, Lindner is correct. The opposite is the case. Already in his... Insofar as Lindner means by this that only under the above circumstances does the possibility of freedom exist for Adorno, he is incorrect. The opposite is the case. Already in Adorno's seminar from the winter semester of 1957 to 58, Adorno rejects the, quote, assumption that the increase in goods on the side of use value could make social antagonisms inoperative, end quote, arguing that, quote, what counts is not increasing the quantity of goods as such. What's decisive is much rather the relation between the terms constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, which characterize capitalist production, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Marx uses lowercase c to denote constant capital, which is composed of the means of production, lowercase v to denote variable capital, and lowercase s to denote surplus value. Production occurs not for the sake of surplus values, and certainly not for the sake of fulfilling human needs, but rather for the sake of profit, whose rate of surplus value can be calculated from these three variables. The rate of profit is equal to surplus value divided by constant capital and variable capital. End footnote. As is shown by the discussion of the economically unproductive labor which Milton performed with Paradise Lost, Adorno makes the Marxian, quote, punchline, end quote, of this exposition his own. This punchline reads as follows. Quote, productive labor, according to the prevailing capitalist system, is only that labor which falls into the capitalist valorization process, which produces exchange value. What does not produce exchange value, however, much use value it might produce, what does not produce exchange value, however much use value it might produce, however productive it may be in a higher sense, is indeed, according to the rules of the game of society, in spite of all the ideal society professes, precisely not productive labor, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, the order in which these vast quantities of goods is produced is subject to the exchange principle. Moreover, the competitive principle makes the compulsion to produce unavoidable. It is precisely these laws of motion which should be affected by the theory, not the variable phenomena of massively increased production, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. And that's the end of chapter 11 of Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's Critique of Political Economy, translated by Adam Baltner. Thank you so much for listening.